Jason Ryder was a hometown hero, a rising MMA star whose grit and discipline won him glory in the cage, while Emily Carter, his devoted fiancée, was the smiling presence always at his side. But one late-night 911 call would shatter that image forever, exposing not a love story, but a trail of secrets, violence, and the chilling truth of a fighter who carried his battles far beyond the arena. The recording began with the shrill tone of a 911 dispatcher answering a late-night call. On the other end was a man's voice, heavy with panic, his words tripping over each other. He gasped for air, stammering that his fiancée had collapsed, that she wasn't breathing, that he needed help immediately. His tone was frantic, but buried beneath the rush of words was something off. Something that didn't feel like raw fear. The operator asked for his location, and he rattled off the address too quickly, almost as if he had memorized it in advance. It was subtle, but the seeds of doubt were planted right there in the first seconds of the call. The dispatcher guided him through basic instructions, telling him to check for a pulse and begin chest compressions. The man claimed he was trying, claimed he was doing everything possible, yet his breathing never shifted the way most people's do when attempting CPR. It sounded too even, too steady. The pauses between his words were telling, like someone stalling while searching for the right phrases. Later, when investigators replayed the recording, they noted how his tone would swell with emotion and then drop flat again, like an actor fumbling through a poorly rehearsed script. For nearly 8 minutes, the call stretched on, a tense mixture of sobs, instructions, and silence. On the surface, it seemed like an emergency unfolding in real time. But beneath that surface, something darker lingered. The dispatcher, though trained to remain calm, couldn't shake the sense that the man was performing more than pleading. She sent out first responders with a note of caution, flagging the call as unusual. As help raced toward the suburban home, the 911 center logged every second. The timing, the hesitations, the contradictions all were preserved in digital clarity. At one point, the man insisted his fiancée had simply collapsed out of nowhere, but moments later he described her hitting her head against a table. That contradiction was small enough to pass unnoticed in the moment, but large enough to raise questions once the call was reviewed. He repeated certain phrases word for word, circling back to the same points as if clinging to a storyline he didn't want to lose. The power of the 911 call lies in its rawness, in its ability to capture people stripped bare in moments of true crisis, but this call lacked that rawness. It sounded strained, hollow, filled with emotion that didn't quite reach the heart. Every syllable was preserved, and every pause spoke louder than the words themselves. By the time sirens pierced the quiet neighborhood, the suspicion had already begun to grow. The neighbors, woken by flashing lights and the rumble of engines, peered from their windows, seeing the chaos unfold. To them, it was another late-night emergency. To investigators listening later, it was the opening act of something sinister. A single phone call meant to summon help instead opened a door into a case that would shake the community and drag one of its most admired figures into the darkest kind of spotlight. Jason Ryder's name was known well beyond the borders of his hometown. His rise through the ranks of mixed martial arts had been swift, built on a combination of raw talent and relentless training. Crowds filled arenas to watch him fight, chanting his name as he stepped into the cage. Reporters often described him as disciplined, focused, and almost mechanical in his precision. For many young fans, Jason was a symbol of strength, someone who had turned sweat and sacrifice into glory. On posters, in interviews, and under the bright lights, he was untouchable. But the image of a hero was only half the truth. At home, the picture was far less polished. Emily, his fiancée, had been by his side from the early days of his career, long before the sponsorships and the televised fights. She was the one who drove him to his first training sessions, who sat in the hospital waiting rooms after brutal sparring injuries, who stitched together the quiet moments between victories and defeats. Friends often spoke about her loyalty, how she believed in him even when others doubted. Yet behind the smiles captured in social media posts and the carefully posed photographs at weigh-ins, there were cracks in the relationship that no one outside their walls could see. Those who lived near the couple began noticing late-night arguments, muffled shouting that spilled through the walls, doors slamming at odd hours. Sometimes Emily would vanish for a day or two, staying with relatives before returning to Jason's side as though nothing had happened. Neighbors whispered but never intervened, convinced that every couple had their battles. Still, some recalled the sight of Emily covering up bruises with long sleeves, even in the heat of summer. She explained them away as accidents or clumsy falls, her words rehearsed with the same practiced ease Jason displayed in front of the press. For Jason, the pressure was mounting. Wins brought money and fame, but they also brought expectations. Every fight was another chance to prove himself, and every mistake was broadcast for the world to see. Emily, once his greatest source of comfort, became the closest witness to his frustration. When the cameras turned off and the arena lights dimmed, Jason carried the weight of his ambition home, and Emily bore the brunt of it. Yet to the public, they remained the perfect couple. Photographs showed them laughing together, hands clasped, faces glowing with the look of two people deeply in love. At fight nights, Emily cheered the loudest, her voice rising above the crowd as Jason's hand was lifted in victory. Reporters praised their bond, describing Emily as Jason's anchor, the woman who kept him grounded in the chaos of competition. No one imagined the storm that was quietly building behind closed doors. The contrast was stark, a man adored by fans for his discipline, but feared by the one who knew him most intimately. The polished champion in the cage was not the same man pacing the quiet rooms of their home. The gap between Jason's public image and his private reality widened with each passing month until it became a chasm too deep to conceal. The flashing lights from the emergency vehicles lit up the quiet suburban street as paramedics rushed into the Ryder home. Inside, the scene was far different from what Jason's frantic 911 call had described. Emily lay motionless on the living room floor, her body twisted at an angle that suggested she had fallen hard. Jason pointed to the edge of a wooden table, insisting she had collapsed and struck her head there. His words spilled out quickly, almost as though he needed to get the explanation out before anyone could form their own conclusions. But the more the first responders looked around, the less his version of events seemed to fit. The living room carried the unmistakable signs of chaos. A glass vase had been shattered against the wall, its shards scattered across the carpet. Cushions from the sofa were strewn across the floor, and a lamp lay toppled on its side. These details might have been overlooked as the result of a frantic response to an accident. But what caught the attention of the responders were the small defensive wounds visible on Emily's hands and arms. They were the kind of injuries a person sustained when trying to protect themselves from blows. The suggestion was immediate and chilling. Whatever had happened here was no accident. Paramedics worked swiftly, checking for vital signs, but it was already too late. Emily's injuries were too severe, her body too still. As the team confirmed her death, Jason began pacing the room, his hands running through his hair, repeating his story again and again. He told anyone who would listen that Emily had simply collapsed, that she had fainted without warning. Yet the blood pooled beneath her head told a different story, one that was impossible to ignore. Detectives soon arrived, surveying the room with trained eyes. Their focus fell on the inconsistencies, the trail of blood droplets leading away from the body, the smudge of a handprint against the wall, and the irregularity of the blood stain near the table Jason had pointed out. It was as though a violent struggle had played out across the living room, the walls themselves holding fragments of the truth. Jason's explanation of a sudden collapse did not align with the evidence that surrounded them. Neighbors began to gather outside as word spread. Some whispered that they had heard shouting earlier in the evening, though no one had thought to call the police at the time. Others simply watched in stunned silence, unwilling to believe that tragedy had struck the couple whose lives seemed so perfect in public. Yet the officers working inside the home already understood that what they were seeing pointed far beyond tragedy. It suggested intent. As Jason was escorted to the side for questioning, his composure began to fracture. He repeated himself, circling back to the same explanation he had given on the 911 call, but every word seemed thinner in the presence of the evidence. The living room that he had claimed was the site of a sudden accident was now being photographed from every angle, its details captured and preserved, each broken object, each stain. Each wound on Emily's body was another piece of a puzzle that would reveal a darker picture. The story Jason had tried to tell was already unraveling. In the days that followed Emily's death, the investigation began to peel away the thin layers of Jason Ryder's account. Detectives moved carefully but thoroughly, treating the case not as a tragic accident but as a potential crime scene that demanded answers. Forensic teams returned to the house repeatedly, combing over the living room and the surrounding rooms with meticulous precision. Every drop of blood, every mark on the furniture, every broken item was photographed, collected, and cataloged. The first breakthrough came when experts examined the blood patterns on the carpet and walls. The direction and spread indicated that Emily had not simply fallen in one spot. Instead, the stains suggested movement, as though she had been struck and staggered before collapsing. The inconsistencies mounted as the autopsy report arrived. The medical examiner determined that Emily's injuries were not consistent with a simple fall. The blunt force trauma to her head was severe, but there were also deep bruises on her arms and ribs, signs of repeated impact. Her fingernails told their own story, carrying traces of Jason's skin and blood beneath them. It was proof that she had fought back in the final moments, clawing at him in desperation. The conclusion was clear. Emily had not died from an accident. She had been attacked. Digital evidence added another devastating layer. Investigators searched Emily's phone and found text messages that painted a grim picture of the months leading up to her death. Some messages showed her reaching out to friends about arguments, confessing that she was afraid of Jason's temper. Others revealed her doubts about their engagement, hinting that she had been considering leaving him. On Jason's phone, detectives uncovered messages that contradicted the calm and disciplined image he projected to the public. His words were laced with anger, jealousy, and a growing sense of control over Emily's life. Security camera footage from a gas station less than a mile from their home provided a crucial piece of the timeline. At around 3 in the morning, Jason's car was caught on camera pulling into the lot. He was seen buying cleaning supplies, his face hidden under a hood. Less than 20 minutes later, he returned home, only to dial 911 shortly afterward. The recording of that call, once seen as the desperate cry of a man trying to save his fiancée, now sounded rehearsed, a cover carefully laid out to hide the truth. Every pause, every contradiction, every unnecessary detail became a crack in the facade he had built. Detectives also uncovered financial records that revealed growing pressure in Jason's life. Despite his fame, his career was faltering with fewer fight contracts and mounting debts. Friends later admitted that Jason often spoke about feeling trapped, both by his financial struggles and by his relationship with Emily. The narrative that had once portrayed him as a rising star in the world of combat sports was replaced by the picture of a man spiraling, desperate to maintain control. The evidence formed a story too strong to ignore. Emily's death was no accident, no tragic collapse as Jason had claimed. The signs of violence were clear, the proof undeniable. What began as a suspicious 911 call had unraveled into a case built on forensics, digital footprints, and the chilling reality of a man who had tried and failed to hide the truth. The trial of Jason Ryder drew national attention, the fall of a celebrated fighter playing out in a courtroom instead of an arena. Crowds gathered outside each day. Some still clinging to the image of the disciplined athlete they had admired, others eager to see justice for Emily. Inside, the air was heavy with tension. The prosecution moved methodically, laying out every piece of evidence they had collected. They replayed the 911 call for the jury, dissecting Jason's words, pointing out the unnatural pauses, the contradictions, and the moments where his performance slipped. What had once sounded like panic now rang hollow, a desperate attempt to control a narrative already crumbling. Witnesses were called to the stand, each one adding a piece to the larger picture. Neighbors recounted the shouting matches that had rattled the walls of their quiet street. Friends testified about Emily's growing fear and her secret confessions about Jason's temper. Medical experts detailed the injuries that could not be explained by a simple fall. The autopsy photographs, shown only briefly, left the courtroom in stunned silence. Every layer of Jason's story was peeled away until nothing was left but the violence he had tried to conceal. The defense attempted to paint a different picture, portraying Jason as a man under immense pressure, someone who had lost control in a tragic accident. They spoke of his injuries in the cage, the toll of a career built on violence, and the emotional strain that came with public expectations. But each argument faltered against the weight of the evidence. The jury did not see a man broken by the demands of fame. They saw someone who had chosen to unleash his fury on the person closest to him and then attempted to cover it with lies. The turning point came when the prosecution revealed the surveillance footage from the gas station. The grainy video showing Jason buying cleaning supplies in the dead of night struck like a final blow. It connected the dots in a way that words alone could not. The jury now had a visual, undeniable proof of his intent to cover up what had happened inside the home. Coupled with the scratches on his arms and the blood under Emily's nails, the story was complete. When the verdict was read, the courtroom was silent. Jason Ryder, once cheered by thousands, was found guilty of second-degree murder. Emily's family wept quietly, holding one another as the decision confirmed what they had always believed. Jason sat still, his expression hard, the fighter's mask finally cracking as the reality of his fate settled in. The sentence was decades in prison, his career and freedom gone in an instant. The aftermath rippled beyond the courtroom. Fans who once celebrated his victories now struggled to reconcile the man they had idolized with the man who had taken a life. The community that had embraced him as a hero now spoke his name with bitterness and disbelief. Emily's story became a rallying cry, a reminder of the dangers that can lurk behind closed doors, even in the lives that seem most perfect from the outside. The legacy Jason had built in the cage was erased, replaced by the haunting truth exposed through a single phone call. What began as a voice on a 911 line ended as the undoing of a fighter who could not escape the darkness within himself.